Right, guys, let's get started. Those with their mics on and their volume, please let's reduce that. So, we want to get working a bit more on our classes. We'll try and explain how a class works in this project. So, we want to understand how we can work with our classes and our objects. So we create a new project and we call it vehicle because we want to deal with the vehicle class, and then we'll be having our content for our particular class. So to begin with, a class has a keyword, and our keyword would then be the name of the class and the objects that we would want to work with within our class. So let's say in this particular instance, we want to create our class, and our class is as follows. So we put it as class, and then the name of the class is part. That then becomes the title of our class. So as you can see on line 5, we've got the class title, which is class, and then we've got the name of the class, which is part. At the same time, we can then start working with this class as an object. So in other words, we can then reference this object, which is our class, as a element or a value that we want to work with within our main. So according to the previous lesson that we did, we'd need to call the name of the class, which is part, and then we need to give a value of that object that we'll then be able to use within this within the main class. So in other words, we're then saying the moment we get to line 11, we're then calling the object part, which is a class. So part becomes our object, and then line 11 becomes our reference to our object class, and we can be able to use our object based on what we want to work with. Let's get into the values that we want to work with within our class. So our class contains two sections, and each section we can then be able to explain how it works. The first section is a private. So private simply means all objects in this section are private to the class. So any elements that are not part of our object class, which is part, will not be able to be accessed at this particular section or within this particular section. Any objects that are public can be accessed or can be referenced from the same class, but with privileges given under the public section of our class. So let's have the values that we want to work with under private, which is the first one is int, and then we have a model number, this gives us part number. We've also got a int part number, which gives us a description of the part. And then we've got a float, and then we've got our cost. This gets the price of the part. From there, we then now need a public set of objects. And in our public set, we want to create elements that we'll be able to use within the public setting of our class. We will show how these work within our main function a little bit later on, but let's have the content of our public. So we've worked with functions before, so we'd want to create a function that would be set part, and then this function would then have 3 variables within it, which will be, the first variable will be mn, the next variable would be pn, the next variable would be a float, and then this float would be our price. From there, we then want to initialize each of these values with the values in our private, or the elements that we've got under our private. So what this then means is we'll have each of these variables being equal to sum of our function variable. So for example, model number would be equal to our mn, our part number would be equal to our pn, our cost will be equal to our price. So we can maybe put some comments to this to say this will assign values to our class. It gets private values and assigns Maluza network. Right. So we shall proceed. So we're saying at this particular instance, for example, on line 12, or rather line 13, we want to initialize our private variable within our public variable. So in other words, if we are outside of this class, we can only access the public variables, but the public variables can access the private variables because it's within the same class. So we then want to display what these elements are. So we create another function, and this function we call it void display. Right? What we want our void display to give us is to show us the available values or available paths. So we can put a cout, and our cout gives us the following: display path details. We can put an end line, and then we want to display our content. So we can put a cout, and then the first thing we want to do is put our model number. For our model number, we then put the variable model number, and we put our end line so that we end that particular line. We want a cout. Our cout, we want to be able to get our part. For our part, we then put our part number. And then we want to cout. The last thing we want is the costs. So put the costs, and then we put the variable for our costs, which is cost. So given that, we can now go into our main function. Our main function should then give us the following. We want to be able to initialize the first function, which is set part, and then we want to be able to show the next function, which is display. So for us to be able to access the functions, if we do it this way, we would have done it wrongly, simply because these functions are stored within our class. So they need to put part one dot, and then we access the function. We also put part one dot, and then we also access that particular function. So with this function, we then need to put our values. First value is our model number. Our model number can be something like 77234. Our part number can be 112, and then our price can be 24.45. So if we've done it that way, our class is complete. our class would be complete, and we will have uh, something that gives us how our class works and the output for our given class. Work with our code a bit and then explain what each element is doing. So we'll come back to our source, whereby we've got a part, which is our class. Our class is our class part, whereby we've got private values, we've got public values. With our private values, we've got our model number, we've got our part number, we've got our cost. All these are general variables, but they're under the keyword private. So in other words, they only work within this particular class. From there, we then have our public, which is our elements that can be accessed outside of our class. So you then notice that we've got set part, and set part gets our values, which is MN, PN, and price. And then we've got those values being initialized within the function set part. So we've got MN, we've got part number, we've got our costs. We've also got our display, where our display gets the model number, the part, and the cost. If we come to our main function, we can then be able to have our part and part one. Part, we access our set part. We also access our display, and then this gives us our value. Are we together? Okay, so this is our class, or this is how we can work with our class, and it is for our vehicle parts. So let's say we want to get vehicle parts and we want to use them in this particular instance. However, we can modify this same code to come up with a slightly different concept of the code so that we get to understand it a little bit better. So let's modify our program so that it gives us something slightly different from what we've got there. We've all received a copy of what we have as a draft. As everyone received it. Let me also send it on Google Class. So that is a copy of our code. Let's modify our code by having a new code that will change a few elements, and we can have an example. So we want to create a new setup of the same class, but we'll modify some of the content that we've had. So we'll still have a class, and then this class name will still be part, and would want to have some private values and some public. Right. Let us proceed. I hope you can see what I'm sharing. Can you see what I'm sharing? Google Class. Trikona Tese. Okay, Saka, we are starting over. I don't know why it stopped. Right. Atikushanda nayo. Tukushanda nepa ikutevera yacho. Right. So let's proceed. We want to create a similar code with the first code that we've got. So like we said, we've got a private section whereby we will have our variables. And we've also got a public section where we will initialize those same variables. And so we still want to work with a part. Okay, we want to work with a part, and we want to work with certain values for our specific part that we want to work with. So for the first value, we can put int, and then we want to have a part number. We'll still have the same or similar content. We then want to have a string, and then we want a description. We also want to have the price. So we have a float, and then we have the price. So we want the part number, we want a description, we also want a price. From there, we want to have our public, and with our public, we then want to still work with a function or with functions, and we'll do it as follows. We have a void, set part. We then put our brackets to show that this is a function. And then within our function, we then want to have parameters for each of the values that we've got there. So we put an int, and then we have a part number. We put a string, and then we have a description. We put it as ds. We have a float, and then we have it as P for price. Then we also initialize the same manner that we did previously, whereby we say our part number is equal to our PN. We then have our description being equal to our DS. We then have our price being equal to our P. So put a void, and then we've got our display. So for our display, we still want to have the same content, whereby we have a cout, and our cout gives us the part details. We have a cout. We want to get the part number, and the part number would be our part number. We have a cout, and then the next element is our description. And then the last one will be our price. Like that. So we have simply recreated what we had previously, but in our main is where we want to modify our program a bit. So we have changed a few things, but we want to modify it so that it runs a little bit different from what we previously had. And also, we can be able to initialize our content in a different way. So let's come to our main and we call our part. And then this time we give it a different name. We call it new part. That's the only difference that we will have. And we then want to also say at this particular instance, we want to have different variables that we will initialize within our main and then pass them on to our class. So we will have an int part number, which will then say this is equal to 3. We'll have a string uh, description, which will be equal to for lack of a better word, we'll just call it a oil filter, and then we'll have a float, which will be our price, and then we'll put it as 36.99, like that. So we've created our variables outside of our class. We then want to initialize these elements within our class. So we call it new part dot set part, and then we want to put our part number as the first value. We want to put our description as the next value. We want to put our price as the last value. And then our new part then gets our display. If we've done it that way, then we are done with our modification.